the realm of corporate America, where incentives and rewards often come in the form of gadgets and gizmos, a chilling tale has begun to circulate. This story isn't found in any employee handbook or company policy. Instead, it lives in hushed whispers shared over coffee breaks and in the shadows of office corridors. It's the tale of the rewarded victim, a modern urban legend that warns of unseen dangers lurking in the very tools meant to reward and entertain. Now, let us take a slow walk down the dark, empty roads and find the eyes in the house. Jason Darris, a hard-working bachelor in his late 30s, lived a solitary life in a quiet suburb. His days were filled with the routine of a corporate job that he didn't particularly love, but performed diligently nonetheless. His nights were spent unwinding with a glass of whiskey in the comfort of his favorite TV shows. Life was predictable, stable, until the day he received a new smart TV from his company's rewards page. The TV was sleek, modern, and seemingly the perfect addition to his living room. He set it up with enthusiasm, unaware that it would become the gateway to his nightmares. At first, the device worked flawlessly, but it wasn't long before Jason began to notice strange occurrences. Channels would change on their own, often stopping at static-filled screens that held for minutes before switching back. Late at night, Jason would hear odd noises emanating from the TV speakers, a faint buzzing, or a low hum that was impossible to pinpoint. On some nights, he thought he heard whispers, but when he got closer, the sound would stop. He dismissed these events as glitches, the kind of quirks that come with new technology, but as the nights wore on, his unease grew. The TV seemed to have a mind of its own. One evening, as he sat on his couch, the TV turned on by itself. The screen flickered, and then, to his horror, it displayed the inside of his living room. He quickly turned the TV off, but the damage was done. Jason felt a chill run down his spine. Someone was watching him. Jason's paranoia escalated after the incident with the TV. He became hyper-aware of his surroundings, noticing things he had previously ignored. His email inbox filled with strange messages, all from anonymous senders, warning him that he was being watched. The messages were vague, filled with cryptic phrases like, "We see you," and "There's no escape." Jason's anxiety grew with each new email, and he began to question his sanity. One night, he decided to investigate. He checked the TV for bugs, dismantling it piece by piece, but found nothing. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted. He started to notice the power light on his TV blinking at odd times. When he was sure the device was off, he covered the red power light with tape, but that didn't stop the strange occurrences. The TV would still turn on by itself, displaying images that Jason couldn't explain. The situation reached its peak when Jason found a letter on his doorstep. The letter was typed with no return address and contained only one line: "We're closer than you think." Jason's heart raced as he looked around, but the street was empty. He knew that this was not a simple case of malfunctioning electronics. Someone was watching him, and they were getting closer. Jason's end came swiftly and without mercy. One night, as he was drifting off to sleep, he heard a noise downstairs. His heart pounded in his chest as he grabbed a baseball bat and crept down the stairs. The house was silent, eerily so, and for a moment, Jason thought he had imagined the noise. But then, he noticed the front door was ajar. He moved cautiously towards the door, but before he could reach it, two masked men emerged from the shadows, overpowering him. They taunted him, their voices low and mocking, as they tied him to a chair. Jason struggled, but the men were too strong. They laughed as they turned on his TV. showing live footage of the assault from various angles. Jason's last moments were filled with terror and confusion as the men closed in, their knives gleaming in the dim light. They took their time, savoring his fear, before delivering the fatal blow. As Jason's life drained away, the TV continued to broadcast his final moments, capturing every second of his brutal demise. After 3 days of Jason not showing up to work, a wellness check was performed at the Darris house, where, through the front windows, officers witnessed a disturbing scene. Sitting in the middle of the family room was a dining chair, with ropes still tied to the arms and legs, with blood all over the chair and around it on the floor. The police had no leads. 900 miles away, Susan Clark's life was the epitome of suburban bliss. She had a loving husband, 2 adorable young children, and a cozy home that was the envy of her friends. Her husband worked nights, leaving her alone with the kids in the evenings, but she didn't mind. She filled the quiet hours with music and podcasts, thanks to the new radio she'd received from her company's reward program. The radio quickly became her constant companion in the kitchen. She would listen to it while preparing dinner, cleaning up, or simply winding down after putting the kids to bed. But soon the radio began to act strangely. It would turn on by itself, playing eerie static that seemed almost intentional. She brushed it off as an electrical issue, something easily fixed. But then, the whispers started. At first, Susan thought she was imagining things. The whispers were faint, buried under layers of static, but they were there, and they were talking about her. The voice knew her name, her routines, and even the small, private moments that she hadn't shared with anyone. She would change the station, but the whispers would follow, growing louder as the days passed. Her children began waking up terrified, crying about shadows in the house at night. Susan tried to comfort them, but she was growing more terrified herself. One night, while her husband was at work, she was in the kitchen when the radio turned on by itself. The whispers were clearer this time, more direct. "We're coming," they said. Susan stared at the radio, frozen in fear as the static grew louder and louder until it filled the room, drowning out her thoughts. Susan's life became a waking nightmare. The whispers from the radio were no longer confined to the static. They followed her throughout the house, even when the radio was off. She would hear them in the walls, in the vents, as if the house itself was alive with malice. The shadows her children spoke of were no longer just their nightmares. She began seeing them too, flickering at the edges of her vision, always just out of reach. Her husband tried to reassure her, but he wasn't there at night when the terror was at its peak. Susan found herself unable to sleep, lying awake in the dark, listening to the whispers that seemed to grow louder with each passing hour. One night she awoke to the sound of the radio blaring static. She ran to the kitchen, but as she reached for the radio, it abruptly stopped, replaced by a voice she didn't recognize. "We're inside," it said, sending a jolt of fear through her body. The following morning, Susan found things in her house out of place, drawers open, items missing or moved. She knew then that someone had been inside while she slept, but there was no sign of forced entry. The police dismissed her concerns, suggesting she might be stressed and imagining things, but Susan knew better. She was being hunted. One night, a few days after Susan had reported the strange happenings to police, her husband had left for work, and the house was quiet. Too quiet. The whispers had stopped, but Susan felt no relief. Instead, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something terrible was about to happen. She was in the living room reading when she heard the front door creak open. Her heart raced as she jumped to her feet, but before she could react, 2 men burst into the room. They moved with a speed and precision that left her no time to scream. One of the men grabbed her, covering her mouth as she struggled. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a way out, but there was none. The men were professionals, cold and efficient. They tied her hands and feet, gagged her, and carried her out of the house. Her children, awakened by the commotion, ran into the room just in time to see their mother being dragged away. As they loaded her into a van, Susan's last thought was of her children, now alone in the house, traumatized and helpless. The children exited the house as the van sped off with their mom inside and ran to a neighbor's home. Within 25 minutes, the house was a frenzy of police officers. Susan's husband rushed home to a house of horrors. The police still have no leads. In the Pacific Northwest, Daniel Robertson was enjoying his newfound independence. Fresh out of college, he had landed a decent job and moved into his first apartment. It wasn't much, but it was his. And that was all that mattered. To celebrate, he used his company's welcome package to order a 75-inch smart TV, a luxury he had always wanted but couldn't afford before. The TV was everything he had hoped for, offering endless entertainment options and serving as the centerpiece of his living room. But soon, after setting it up, Daniel began to experience issues. The screen would glitch at random intervals, distorting the images in ways that were both unsettling and unnatural. Faces would warp, eyes would appear where they shouldn't, and sometimes the screen would go completely black, only to flash back on with a burst of static. One night, as he was watching a movie, the screen froze. Daniel got up to check the cables, assuming it was a loose connection, but when he glanced back at the screen, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The reflection on the screen wasn't his. It was someone else's. A face, gaunt and pale, was staring back at him from the darkness of his apartment. Panicked, Daniel turned the TV off and unplugged it from the wall, but the reflection lingered for a moment before fading into the blackness. From that night on, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He tried to ignore it, but the glitches became more frequent, the faces more distinct. He would hear strange noises in his apartment late at night, footsteps, breathing, but whenever he checked, there was no one there. Daniel's descent into paranoia was swift and brutal. The glitches in his TV became more frequent, the distorted faces more menacing. He stopped using the TV, but it didn't matter. The fear had already taken root. He would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps outside his bedroom door, but when he checked, the hallway would be empty. One night, Daniel woke to find his apartment bathed in the glow of his TV. Even though he hadn't turned it on, the screen was filled with static, but as he watched, the static began to shift, forming images that made his stomach turn. The images were of him, sleeping in his bed, captured from an angle that could only be from inside the room. Panicked, Daniel unplugged the TV and threw it out of his apartment, but the sense of dread didn't leave him. He began receiving anonymous messages on his phone, describing his every move in chilling detail. The messages would arrive seconds after he performed an action, confirming that someone was watching him in real time. His apartment, once a sanctuary, became a prison of fear. Daniel knew he was not alone, but every time he tried to escape, he felt the presence closing in on him. Daniel's paranoia had reached its peak by the time the intruders came for him. He had barricaded himself in his apartment, convinced that something terrible was about to happen. He was right. The attack came in the middle of the night. Daniel was jolted awake by the sound of glass shattering in the living room. He grabbed the knife he had been sleeping with and crept towards the noise. His heart pounded in his chest, but his fear was tempered by a grim determination. He wasn't going down without a fight. But as he approached the living room, he realized with horror that the intruders had already gotten in. Two figures dressed in black were standing in the middle of the room, watching him with cold, calculating eyes. They didn't say a word. They advanced towards him. Daniel swung the knife wildly, but it was of no use. The men disarmed him with ease, knocking him to the ground. They pinned him down, their faces expressionless as they began their work. Daniel's screams were muffled by a thick piece of tape over his mouth as the men methodically dismembered him while still alive. In his final moments, Daniel's mind flashed back to the distorted faces he had seen on his TV, the faces that had been watching him all along. Now, they were real, and they were here to finish what they had started. The next morning, a coworker showed up to Daniel's apartment to give him a ride. Once reaching his door, she noticed it was cracked open. She knocked gently and stuck her head inside. In less than 2 seconds, she was in the hallway against the far wall, screaming for help. The police found a pool of blood in the middle of the living room, a piece of tape, and a few strips of what looked like shaved skin. Currently, the case has gone cold. In the southwest desert lands, Linda Foster was used to the quiet life of a small town. She enjoyed the peace, the routine, and the sense of security that came with living in a place where everyone knew everyone. She lived alone by choice in a quaint little house on the outskirts of town. Her only connection to the outside world was her radio, which she had recently upgraded using points from a customer loyalty program. The new radio was more advanced than her old one, with features she didn't fully understand or need, but it worked well enough, and she appreciated the clarity of the sound it provided. However, it wasn't long before the radio began to exhibit odd behavior. It would turn on by itself, often in the middle of the night, blasting static-filled broadcasts that she couldn't turn off, even by unplugging the device. The static was unnerving. But what frightened Linda the most were the voices that sometimes cut through the noise. The voices were low, almost inaudible at first, but they grew louder over time. They spoke in hushed tones, discussing her as if she were an object, a target. They described her routine, her habits, and even mentioned things about her life that no one else should know. Linda's unease turned to fear when she realized that the voices were coming from inside her house. She would walk into the living room to find the radio on, the voices discussing her movements in real time. She tried to dismiss it as a trick of mind, but the fear was too strong to ignore. One night, the voices spoke directly to her, calling her by name and telling her that they were coming for her. Linda sat in the dark, trembling, as the radio continued its eerie broadcast. Linda's fear had become a constant companion. The voices on the radio grew bolder, speaking directly to her now, as if they knew she was listening. They described her every move, predicting her actions before she even took them. She tried to confide in her neighbors, but they dismissed her concerns as paranoia, a product of living alone for too long. One night, the voices told her to look outside. Hesitantly, she approached the window, and what she saw made her blood run cold. A figure stood in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the porch light, watching her house. She couldn't make out any details, but she knew, without a doubt, that it was the person who had been tormenting her. Linda didn't sleep that night. She sat in the dark, clutching a kitchen knife, waiting for the intruder to make their move. But morning came, and the figure was gone. The radio, however, continued its relentless torment, now speaking of things only someone inside her house could know. Linda's fear reached a breaking point, and she decided she needed to get out before it was too late. Linda's escape was a desperate, harrowing experience. After the voices on the radio told her that her time was up, she knew she had to act fast. She packed a small bag and fled her house, driving aimlessly through the night until she found herself in a neighboring town. She checked into a motel under a fake name, hoping to lay low until she could figure out what to do next. But the men found her anyway. It was only a matter of time. Linda was jolted awake by the sound of someone trying to force the door open. Panic surged through her as she scrambled out of bed. Grabbing the bag she had packed earlier, she looked around the room for a weapon, but there was nothing useful. The door burst open just as she was about to make a run for it. 2 men entered the room wearing all black and head coverings. There was no way out, no escape. But then, in a moment of desperation, she grabbed the bedside lamp and hurled it at the nearest man. The lamp shattered against his head, causing him to stumble. Linda took the opportunity to run, bolting past the other and out the door. She didn't stop running until she was several blocks away. her lungs burning and her legs ready to give out. She found a police station and burst in, gasping out her story to the officers on duty. They were skeptical at first, but when Linda led them back to the motel, they found the room ransacked with evidence of a struggle. The motel and Linda's house were thoroughly checked over and over for forensic evidence. No fingerprints or hair samples, other than Linda's, were ever found at either scene. No security or ring cameras had caught any view of the two assailants. The police reported they didn't find any radio inside of Linda's property. The last time Linda was seen came from one of her neighbor's interviews. He had witnessed Linda leaving her front door in a dress suit, with paperwork in her hands. Linda had been leaving for the courthouse for another interview session with the assistant DA. Currently, police have no leads. The urban legend of the eyes in the house had taken root, a chilling tale of modern technology turned against its users. Each victim's story was unique, yet eerily similar, bound by the common thread of company rewards. The legend serves as a stark reminder of the dangers lurking in our connected world. It warns of the unseen eyes watching from behind the screens, the silent listeners hidden within our gadgets. This urban legend isn't just about the victims, but also about the pervasive fear of surveillance in the digital age. It highlights the thin line between convenience and vulnerability, urging people to question the true cost of their modern luxuries. So, the next time you're watching your television and see the little red light, make sure you ask yourself, is anyone watching back?